Well. Okay. Great. Well, welcome everyone. To some extent, this is an annual event because every spring we have a doctoral student food for thought where they present their findings. Hello. Oh,
Turn on this mic. I'm sorry, he said this to me.
okay. Sorry. That information was not shared with me. Is that better? Okay. Yes, you can hear me on the mic, or you could just hear me because my voice is loud.
I just doesn't, yeah. I haven't said we have to use this. Hello?
There you go. Okay, great. I think we have two microphones on. Now I turn this one off. Now we have no microphones on.
So this is off. Try it one more time.
Hello? Okay, I'm not gonna move. As I was saying, to some extent, this is an annual event because every spring we have a doctoral student food for thought, but this is also unprecedented in that we've never had 3 history students present at the same time. So that's very exciting. I'm gonna introduce them all, and then they're gonna go in the order in which they've been introduced, and they will speak for not more than 12-ish minutes and maybe 13, 15. Okay, so they will speak quickly, and then there will be at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So Sadie Bergen is a 7th-year PhD candidate in the history and ethics of public health. This makes me want to die.
Is it easier on? Can you go over there?
Sorry.
Hold on. You just.
Well, if I shout them, the people on Zoom, I don't know if they're not here. I don't think the Zoom people get doing what they're doing. Right, that was what I thought.
Yeah. Why don't I call the IT people?
Okay, what are you calling it? I'll do the introduction. So Sadie graduated from the University of Chicago with a BA in history in 2015. Her dissertation project, advised by Lily Californian and supported by the Center for PhD Scholarship, examines the social and political history of maternal and infant healthcare, particularly the rise of neonatal intensive care as a feature of late 20th century American hospitals. Her work brings historical context to issues of reproductive health equity and expands topics including reproductive health risks in the workplace and physicians' abortion politics. Valentina Parisi is a 6th-year PhD candidate, also in this department, who studied anthropology and immunobiology at Brown, where she received a BA and an MS. She graduated from Mailman with her MPH in 2017, after which she worked as a program officer in Department of Sanitation and Family Health. Valentina rejoined the department in 2018, and her dissertation considers the control and management of pandemic influenza during the 20th century, with attention to the politics of preparedness in the face of advancing science and technology. Her advisor is Professor Stephen Krishna, and her research is supported by the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health. Sarah Jean Samuel is a doctoral candidate finishing her PhD, also in history grad. Prior to matriculating at Columbia, Sarah completed her bachelor's in the history of science and medicine at Yale. Her research, which she's doing under the supervision of Professor James Colgrove, examines the historical roots of global vaccine hesitancy and diplomatic utility of mass vaccination campaign and the American foreign policy, and is supported by many sources, including the National Institute of NIMHD, Population Reference Bureau, the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, and by a foreign language area studies fellowship. When she's not writing her dissertation, Sarah enjoys the company of a toothless dog named Darwin, playing pickleball and speed writing for justice. He's coming. He's coming. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We can't use the mic because of the feedback.
What if we mute the Zoom?
Okay, so, why don't
Said to get to Zoom, we have to go here.
save us.
No, I'm not gonna save you.
And then he said,
Jesus.
He's on his way, so we could just start and not.
okay.
We wanted to tell people on Zoom they're gonna have to wait a minute and they'll start and wait for them to come.
Because we can't figure out how to mute Zoom.
He said we could get to it through Windows, but I don't
Here we
see
are.
it. Oh, here we go.
are.
Here we go. Mute.
Yeah.
But here's Simon, so we're okay.
There's some back with the microphone.
Yeah. Hello. Test 1, 2. Sorry, what did you say?
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Hello, test 1, 2, test 1, 2, test. Hey. Works. I just lowered the speaker a little bit. So what happened was that probably when it was a little too loud from the speaker. So with the mic nearby, I'll pick up that. Yeah, but should be good now.
Should I hold it or can I leave it?
You can leave it if you want. This also goes to Zoom.
Okay, so I can
Okay.
put it here.
Yep.
And just talk, and
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Why is this not going back to?
No, I would love it if it did, because that's not my first
Right.
slide.
Simon, how do we
While I'm
make?
here.
Yeah, so I need it to be the PowerPoint and not the third slide. How is it that, okay, so. if I
Why
go
is it
like-
when we did
Yeah,
it?
I don't-
Whatever.
Okay, that's great. No problem at all. Okay, great. Teamwork makes the dream work. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back. Thank you to Jennifer for the introduction. So I'm gonna try to be snappy. What follows is a or a version of one chapter of my dissertation, which is broadly about the spatial politics of maternal and newborn medicine in the mid to late 20th century US, beginning in the New Deal era. So the shift of childbirth from home to the hospital in the mid 20th century is a very classic story in the history of gender and medicine in the US, wherein birthing people were promised safer, more controlled childbirth experiences through the capacities of scientific medicine in the hospital. By the 1950s, hospital birth was the norm, no matter who you were or where you lived, and it became more routinized, standardized, and eventually safer. But birthing experiences remained deeply unequal, and in particular, racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality and morbidity persisted and by some measures increased over the course of this transition. My dissertation takes this that's too fast. My dissertation takes this spatial reconfiguration of birth as a starting point and examines some understudied stories at the intersection of geography, the built environment, birth, and public health in American history. I would say that in general, I am trying to build a historical understanding of the extent to which health is tied to place, something that in SMS we're very familiar with, by looking at the political, social, and economic processes through which birth has become tied to specific power-laden sites of medical care. This is one of the later chapters in the dissertation, and it's a case study of the politics surrounding a new neonatal intensive care unit and high-risk maternity unit in the suburbs of Westchester County in the 1970s and early 1980s. Okay, so just for some quick common ground setting, perinatal care encompasses late pregnancy, birth, and the month following birth. It's really a temporal classification. It covers the well-being of the pregnant person, a new mother, and a neonate. And the term perinatal emerged with the rise of newborn infant care as a discrete medical specialty of pediatrics, really beginning in the 1930s, but then we don't see neonatology being articulated as a medical specialty until the 1960s. So that's kind of where we're starting out. And then over the next 2 decades, improvements in resuscitation technologies, nutrition, temperature regulation, and cardiovascular and respiratory support available in newly established neonatal intensive care units, or NICUs, contributed to a 60% decline in the overall mortality rate in the US from 24.7 deaths per 1,000 births to only 10. In the 1970s, the geographic distribution of NICUs, or how best to disperse this highly specialized care within a population, became the subject of a lot of debate. And ultimately, perinatal care became one of the most fully actualized examples of regionalization, which is a health planning methodology that has its origins in the 1920s, but became increasingly mainstream in the United States in the context of health policy reform in the 1970s. So what is regionalization? Regionalization is a structured approach to healthcare delivery that quote unquote rationalizes the distribution of expensive and scarce medical services within a geographic area and through a technocratic assessment of its health resources. Through a technocratic assessment of its health resources. I suddenly heard myself speaking. So, in the domain of perinatal medicine, regionalization meant pairing high-risk infants with the highest level of care by creating emergency transportation systems that would transfer infants to tertiary care facilities when needed. And then in the mid-1970s, partly in response to new federal legislation, New York State adopted regionalization as a framework with which to critically review its landscape of obstetric and pediatric care. The impetus for this reassessment was, in the words of the New York Daily News, which is a famously reliable source, tumbling birth rates, a glut of obstetrical beds, and soaring medical costs. An expert committee convened by the State Department of Health in 1973 determined that the state had far more obstetric beds than were needed, particularly in the newly designated HSA 6, which is a federal health service area that encompassed the 7 counties north of New York City, including the suburbs of Westchester County. New York City, and by extension the whole state, had by the mid-1970s entered into an unprecedented fiscal crisis. And beyond that, birth rates had indeed fallen dramatically over the course of a decade, and the steady exodus of white middle-class families from New York City to the suburbs like Westchester had slowed down. So among the expert committee's recommendations was that newly built maternal and neonatal units at the Westchester County Hospital should not open until regional planning authorities had completed a thorough plan for the area. This was very, very bad news for the Westchester County executive, a man named Alfred Del Bello, who had just spent tens of millions of dollars rebuilding the old county hospital, which you can see up here, in Valhalla, New York, about 30 miles outside of New York City. The hospital opened in 1976 with a new name, the Westchester County Medical Center, and ambitious plans to serve as a tertiary care center for specialty services like burn treatment, cardiac care, and for our story, high-risk obstetrics and neonatal intensive care. Okay, I'm gonna skip the full play-by-play, but what followed over the next several years was a pretty convoluted argument between appointed committees, politicians, local physicians, hospital administrators, and community members about the need for a high-risk obstetrics unit and NICU in Westchester. And what we ultimately see, and what I argue in my chapter, is that the technocratic and ideologically narrow goal of regionalization, on which everybody seemed to agree in theory, largely crumbled in the face of organized community protest from a contingent with significant political capital, namely middle-class white mothers and their private physicians. To the state committees that had been tasked with coming up with regionalization plans for Westchester and its surrounding counties, it seemed that residents were readily accessing tertiary care in the existing metropolitan centers of New York City and Albany to the north. The doctors and administration at the Upper East Side's New York Hospital absolutely agreed with that assessment. Dr. Peter Auld, who's head of the Perinatology Center at New York Hospital in the 1970s, argued that the Westchester units would be duplicating existing services needlessly. As he told the New York Times, "We can't allow these things to proliferate on every street corner." And it was true that there was no obvious unmet need for a NICU in HSA 6, which is the set of counties we're talking about, according to the assessments made as part of the regionalization process. So those kinds of assessments included pooled rates of infant mortality and morbidity, and existing patterns of health facility utilization. But New York Hospital and Dr. Auld's assessment was more rooted in institutional self-interest than in concerns about the equitable distribution of specialty care. In pursuit of new revenue during a decade of financial strain, the hospital had spent years pursuing referral agreements with smaller institutions beyond New York City, especially the suburbs of Westchester County. The hospital also debuted a high-risk infant transport service consisting of vehicles that allowed the hospital to move infants from smaller suburban units to the city. This service circumvented a free Department of Health run transport service that served surrounding hospitals in the city. But unlike the city's municipal hospitals, including Bellevue, which is just a few blocks south of New York Hospital on the east side, and also had a NICU, New York Hospital did not have an obligation to accept patients from its immediate surrounding area, which notably had much higher rates of infant mortality and morbidity than the affluent Westchester County. By 1976, most of the infants transported to New York Hospital's Perinatology Center were from outside of the city. But as opposition to the Westchester Hospital units coalesced, County Executive Del Bello, I'm sort of like getting ahead of myself with the slide, but it's okay. County Executive Del Bello recruited the voices of two powerful constituencies, white middle-class suburban mothers and private physicians, to argue on behalf of the NICU and high-risk maternity unit. He collected testimonies from Westchester mothers who had struggled to visit their babies in NICUs in the city, and from doctors who committed to referring their patients to a new county unit. Barbara Hickernell, chairperson of the Westchester chapter of the American Society for Psychoprophylaxis in Obstetrics, which is the first name of what is now Lamaze International, the natural childbirth organization. She emphasized the risks of requiring mothers to travel to New York City, saying, quote, "Are we prepared to set up maternity facilities on the Tappan Zee Bridge? We are not talking of kidney or heart transplants, but of having babies," end quote. So after literally years of back and forth, the New York State Health Commissioner finally recommended that Westchester County units should be opened. And he referred to the county as a, quote, defined market area that needed such services within its boundaries. Indeed, the market of mothers and physicians in the region had made it clear that they were ready to be consumers of the specialized revenue-generating care that Westchester County Medical Center had to offer. And they followed through on that commitment. By 1985, Westchester's new NICU was planning to expand after 2 consecutive years of operating at more than 100% capacity. In Westchester, the unmet need of high-risk mothers and infants turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy, as patients who met those descriptors were constructed in real time by the widening capacities of maternal fetal medicine and neonatology. In 1979, the New York City-based health activist group, the Health Policy Advisory Council, or Health PAC, criticized regionalization for its ideological biases. They wrote the concept of regionalization sounds like the sort of technically neutral, rational approach to planning that no sane person could oppose. Yet in practice, they wrote, smaller facilities are driven out of business on the basis of such unexamined half-truths as supply generates demand and low volume equals low quality. The Westchester case study certainly backs up this assessment. The high-risk maternity unit and NICU were opened as small maternity units across the state and across the country were shut down. But I think the story also adds nuance to Health PAC's assessment by showing how the narrow market-driven orientation of regionalization actually weakened it as a tool of health policy making. By relying strictly on measures like population density and hospital bed utilization rates, the perinatal regionalization of the 1970s neglected a more textured understanding of the geography of healthcare in a particular area. So for example, its racial and socioeconomic residential segregation, or its transportation infrastructure, or the percentage of its population that were publicly insured. In the absence of such data to make equity-driven arguments about health needs, the implementation of perinatal regionalization in the state reinforced a status quo of reproductive politics, building the new sites of high-tech medical care that were demanded by white suburban mothers and their new private physicians. Not their new private physicians, their private physicians. This is not to deny the importance of such care for those who need it, but rather to point to the ways that the failures of perinatal regionalization were contingent, with a different set of underlying assumptions and a more expansive, inclusive, and justice-oriented approach to the spatial politics of birth. There's the potential to build a new landscape of care. That's it. Thank you so much. And thank you to Merlin and my committee, and I'll get off stage now, but say more thank yous at the end. Oh, and let's switch over.
Hello, everyone. I also want to thank Professor Hirsch for that introduction. I want to begin by recognizing that during the last 4 years, all of our lives have been significantly shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here I highlight a report issued by the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs in 2002. The report is dramatically titled, Historically Unprepared. Perhaps unsurprising, this report is critical of the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, lamenting the general unpreparedness of the nation to combat a novel pandemic threat. My research examines the notion of pandemic preparedness from a historical perspective, with attention to the history of influenza control, and I want to start with some broad questions to inspire critical reflection, including how is pandemic preparedness defined, and in turn, unpreparedness? What does pandemic preparedness entail? Who defines it? What factors shift dominant preparedness frameworks across time and place? And lastly, why does pandemic preparedness matter? I want to provide a brief overview of my dissertation project. During the first half of the 20th century, scientists and policymakers in the United States and Europe framed influenza as an unpredictable disease of wartime, a persistent association tied to the deadly 1918 pandemic and the transnational movement of people and goods during the First World War. This association of influenza with global conflict raised pressing and recurrent economic and security concerns and influenced large-scale investments in virology, epidemiology, and infectious disease surveillance during the 20th century. Advancing influenza science and surveillance strategies strongly shaped 20th century's notions of pandemic preparedness and pandemic origin. My dissertation traces the shifting ideas, rationale, and engagements behind influenza preparedness priorities as voiced by multiple stakeholders over the 20th century. I argue that the standardization of global networks of influenza control, surveillance, and communication reflected the prioritization of Western economic and political interests. Here are some central themes underpinning my dissertation projects. These include attention to the relationship between geopolitics and science, and how science can be malleable to particular interests, vocabularies of crisis, how influenza is continuously redefined particular kind of world problem, attention to the relationship between the military-industrial complex and the philanthropic institution, and finally, this notion of continuities of preparedness over the 20th century. I want to note that part of my research considers the role of the Rockefeller Foundation in expanding scientific knowledge concerning influenza. Several important historical investigations highlight the role of Rockefeller and similar organizations in the interwar period and onwards in shaping the establishment of international health infrastructure. Some of these are on the slide. These analyses of Rockefeller Foundation are largely focused on their eradication programming and the legacies of these programmings in the 20th century. However, this scholarship does not readily address Rockefeller's extensive role in shaping 20th century research and surveillance on pandemic influenza. I seek to address this gap and interrogate the longer arc of 20th century pandemic preparedness priorities in the United States. Here's a list of some of the primary sources that I rely on for my analysis. My sources are diverse and are obtained by both traditional archival fieldwork and digital means due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in today's presentation, I want to highlight facets of the Rockefeller Foundation influenza programming during the 1920s through 1940s that shaped 20th century trajectory of pandemic influenza control. I argue that Rockefeller influenza programming shaped long-term scientific understandings of influenza etiology and dominant strategies of pandemic control. I underscore how Rockefeller programming shaped a particular worldview of pandemic crises rooted in 3 central pillars of preparedness: 1, vaccine production and distribution; 2, surveillance; and 3, risk communication. These pillars were introduced in the early 20th century retooled in the context of the First and Second World Wars, and further strengthened during the Cold War era. This framing of preparedness is intimately tied to Western political and economic interests. To begin, I want to underscore that following the 1918 pandemic, there was increased attention to influenza as a pressing scientific problem. This pandemic directly influenced the Rockefeller Foundation's foray into influenza and broader respiratory diseases research in the late 1920s. In the aftermath of 1918, experts across disciplines and institutions prioritized advancements in influenza research. At the Rockefeller Foundation, physician and pathologist Simon Flexner spearheaded influenza research. In 1918, Flexner served as the director of laboratories at the Rockefeller Institute. He would serve in this role for about 30 years. And he articulated two dilemmas underpinning influenza research in the 1920s. The first dilemma related to the uncertainty surrounding the causative agent of influenza. The primary scientific debate related to whether influenza was a bacterial infection or a viral one. Experts across disciplines and institutions sought to solve this problem through direct experiment and advancing laboratory science. The second dilemma is related to the identification of pandemic influenza origins. Flexner described pandemic influenza as a world problem that required collaborative investment by all, he called them scientifically advanced countries. To Flexner, the 1918 pandemic offered an important lesson on the virtues of rendering impotent future pandemics. Interestingly, Flexner believed that pandemic influenza seedbeds resided in Eastern Europe and had to be eradicated at the source. This is a theme that gets refashioned throughout the 20th century, and especially during the Cold War. The notion that pandemic influenza arises from afar, moves from east to west, and invades the United States and Europe. So for the Rockefeller Foundation, a central issue is how to control future pandemics and create a system of early warning for the West that is rooted in advancing laboratory science. And I just want to stress that Flexner isn't simply talking about these dilemmas in the context of the Rockefeller Foundation. This is a transcript of a talk he gave at the American Medical Association in 1919. He was the primary speaker at the conference, and he also discussed these dilemmas. So at Rockefeller, the large-scale investment in influenza research began with the creation of the Acute Respiratory Diseases Division in 1927. Rockefeller leadership commissioned multiple acute respiratory diseases studies beginning in 1927. These studies transformed the Rockefeller Foundation's approach to the influenza problem. And we can see these studies were carried out in diverse regions over a roughly 4-year span. I want to highlight important points related to the assumptions underpinning these studies and the legacy of their findings. And here I include an image of Dr. Wilson Smiley, who was tapped to lead these studies at Rockefeller. So these 4 studies were informed by the 2 competing theories concerning influenza cause that I mentioned earlier. Essentially, is it a bacterial infection or is it a viral one? These theories gained considerable research and public attention during the 1918 pandemic. To identify the causative agent of influenza, Rockefeller sought to venture beyond the confines of its New York laboratories and commissioned a series of field-based studies on the common cold in isolated populations inhabiting different climatic regions. This reference to the common cold underscores the fact that in 1927, it wasn't easy to distinguish between a cold, true influenza, and pneumonia. These studies also considered influenza cause and transmission and related to broader questions surrounding climate, population, isolation, and race. That reasoning was tied to the selection of Wilson Smiley to lead these studies. Smiley did not actually have a background in respiratory diseases. He was actually one of the leaders of hookworm eradication programming for Rockefeller in the southern United States and Brazil. And he associated with colds with physiological changes linked to variations in the environment. So what he would do is he would track acute cold incidents in relation to temperature, rainfall, and humidity. We see an example of that on the graph. And this approach fit within Rockefeller's larger project of linking certain diseases with particular climatic handicaps. And he also considered race within his analysis, seeking to document race-based predispositions to respiratory infections. And it is worth noting that this preoccupation between influenza and race, it does persist through the 1950s. So Smiley's results consistently challenged the theory that bacteria served as the primary agent of common colds and influenza. He could not consistently document a bacterial agent responsible for acute cold incidents. And these studies coincided and supported the work of multiple in-house research teams invested in viral research at Rockefeller at this time. So the combination of field and laboratory research from the late 1920s through early 1930s solidified the Rockefeller Foundation's interest in influenza as a pioneering field of study. As a pioneering field, staff ranked influenza as a problem of significant international importance that for nearly a decade would receive attention comparable to that of malaria and yellow fever in their budgets. The laboratories in New York, established in 1933, would become the home of Rockefeller influenza research for approximately 12 years. And as a final point, I want to stress that the rapid expansion of Rockefeller influenza programming through the IHG laboratories during the 1930s and 1940s. At the advent of the Second World War, there was a ramping up of this programming and the forging of unique partnerships between Rockefeller universities and the U.S. Army in the context of mounting fears over a new potential pandemic threat. So how do they essentially wrap up these activities? So one of the things they do from 1936 to 1948 is to provide numerous grants to domestic universities engaged in influenza research. Some of those universities are listed here, including Columbia. And this image to the left provides an overarching summary of IHD interests related to influenza in 1937. Leadership determined that they needed concurrent studies to control these future pandemic strains. And of course, in the late 1930s, the scientific consensus was that an influenza pandemic would arrive every 20 to 30 years. This pandemic ticking clock informed their grant-making strategies. Rockefeller also heavily invested in the development of influenza vaccines through Rockefeller scientist, Dr. Tommy Francis. Some of you may recognize Francis's name. He's also attributed to developing the polio vaccine. In 1940, Francis isolated influenza B in humans, and he would be responsible for creating the first live attenuated influenza vaccine. He would be instrumental in the development of influenza vaccines and the testing of these vaccines in civilian populations, Army personnel, and institutionalized populations. And as I noted earlier, pandemic influenza invoked security concerns, especially in the aftermath of World War I. And at the advent of World War II, the United States established an influenza commission to develop a safe and effective vaccine. And in 1942, the commission requested a sum of $150,000 from Rockefeller to investigate respiratory diseases in the Army. And this kicked off a multi-year partnership between Rockefeller and the Army during World War II. Rockefeller leadership framed influenza as one of the 4 great potential destroyers of armies during wartime, the other 3 being yellow fever, malaria, and typhus. And then a final note, Rockefeller invested considerable resources into the establishment of respiratory disease laboratories over a 20-year period. They did this across the world from California to Jamaica to Japan. Listening Post laboratories would offer an early warning system to the United States and Europe by tracking cases and submitting reports to central laboratories. Here's an example of an early report here from Hungary. Interestingly, these labs also engaged in the global circulation of biological materials, including virus strains, tissue specimens, sputum samples, and laboratory animals. So why does this matter? Well, the expansive network of IHD-funded laboratories directly influenced the creation of the World Health Organization's Global Influenza Surveillance Network in 1952. Rockefeller's wartime efforts proved invaluable to the expansion of domestic influenza programming. But as World War II came to a close, so did Rockefeller's role in spearheading influenza research. Multiple Rockefeller staff left the organization to lead the new WHO GISN. This prompted internal tensions at Rockefeller and accusations of essentially poaching staff. So they viewed their influenza kind of division as no longer pioneering, and they dropped the funding. But the creation of the GISN reflected evolving Western doctrines of surveillance. For example, during the Truman administration, influential American epidemiologist Henry Van Zyl Hyde explained the importance of influenza surveillance in the GISN. He explained the motives underlying American participation in international health work are humanitarian selfish. A little bit later, Senator Hubert Humphrey will echo these sentiments. When describing the GISN, he described it as a cost-effective tool for the United States, with a follow-up caveat that sick people produce little and they buy little. So you can kind of get a sense of what they're concerned about at that time. So, you know, my project really focused on tracing the continuities and discontinuities in pandemic preparedness frameworks across the 20th century. I argue that the history of influenza research and control is integral to understanding our contemporary preparedness conceptualizations and priorities. And in the context of the Cold War, we do see the institutionalization of specific pandemic preparedness planning at national and international levels, especially following particular influenza crises. This includes the 1957 influenza pandemic, dubbed the Asian flu, the 1968 pandemic, dubbed Mao's flu, or the Hong Kong flu, and finally, a swine flu controversy at Fort Dix. So in these plans, we see the articulation of pandemic memories, like 1918 and 1957, and the repeated association of certain regions of the globe with pandemic influenza risks, namely Asia. So as a final slide, I want to end by noting that influenza pandemic preparedness plans, as introduced by the World Health Organization in the 90s, have been refashioned in the context of other health crises, Ebola, SARS, even COVID now. These plans should be and can be interrogated with attention to the longer history of pandemic preparedness, including how it is defined and who gets to define it. Contemporary pandemic preparedness frameworks are rooted in longer debates surrounding influenza science and surveillance and the politics of expertise. And I just want to end by thanking my committee and all the support I've received from the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I need a second to pull up my slides. But I'm so glad to be here with all of you, assuming I can. I've lost a lot of fights with PowerPoints with this computer, so let's see if I can make this work. Here we go. Yeah, did this work? All right, that's a big deal. I also don't love being attached to this podium. So if y'all can't hear me on the Zoom call, send me a text and I'll get it on my phone. But hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I use she, her pronouns. The title of my presentation today is Shots for Peace, using history to combat global vaccine hesitancy today. And I'm really glad that my colleagues, Sadie and Valentina, dropped the hardcore history on you, because that's not what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to share a little bit more about the personal journey that I went on to produce this dissertation. So I'll start off by telling you how I decided to settle on the topic of my dissertation, a little bit of personal history, a little bit of political philosophy. I'll tell you about what's in my dissertation, and I'll tell you about the dissertation project as a whole, and then chapter by chapter, the research findings that I've discovered. And then I'll share what I think is cool about my dissertation, but I'm conscious of the fact that there's a lot of students on this call and students in the room. So I'll share what is cool about my dissertation, but more importantly, what I think could be cool about y'all's dissertations or y'all's research. Ooh. No, those are friends. Thanks, Sarah. Those are friends of mine, which is so appropriate, because I really do want to start this presentation because gratitude is my attitude. And I'm first and foremost thankful to my committee, Paul Chamberlain, Dr. Tona Barrientos Gutierrez, who supervised my research in Mexico, Professor Ru Millison, Ron, and James. Couldn't have done it without them. World-class experts in their fields, but also just the kindest, gentlest, most supportive advisors a girl could find. For reals, if you're trying to do research like this, get a committee like mine, because it'll make it so much more pleasurable. I'm also so grateful to other faculty in this department, Merlin, David, Kavita, Hopper, and Marnie, especially for straight up giving me a space to have bad ideas before they could be turned into good ideas in this dissertation. In various doctoral seminars, doctoral salons, so grateful for their support. There's also a couple of people outside of Columbia who've been really critical in formulating this dissertation. That's Toshiko Kaneda, Lori Ashford, Ernesto Amaral from the Population Reference Bureau, and Gino Lavasi, used to be in my department, and Alex Eze. Together as a crew, they really helped me translate the findings of this dissertation into policy and media that I'll be sharing more about later. Also, lots of family and friends, many of whom are on this call. Love you guys so much, but couldn't have done it without all y'all, anybody who's had the great misfortune of having a meal with me in the last couple of years has celebrated various brain blasts, but mostly commiserated with me through the process. But I do have to give an extra special shout out to James, who's read every bit of this dissertation as it emerged from my brain. And that included all of the inane commentary that gets sent to James with every draft. So I've asked for James's expertise on the nature of the English language. I'm really trying not to get canceled in the process of writing this dissertation. Not sure if we're using the word peasant. I'm sure James has got useful feedback on that in the draft of the document I haven't read yet. And of course, this whole dissertation is a bad pun. But they were worse puns before James stepped in and improved. So James, truly, tremendously so grateful. Oh, that was quick. Look at me stealing my own thunder. Here we go. How did I decide what to put in my dissertation? I've always been a Leslie Knope fangirl. That's a Parks and Rec reference, but I'm a big believer in the power of government to do good in the world. Like that's just part of my political philosophy, but also a little bit of my brothers in the room, our family history. Like our parents came to this country as a persecuted religious minority, and now my brother and I we're doing okay for ourselves, right? So we're living an American dream that straight up should be more accessible to more people and really should have been easier for us too. And this dissertation articulates ways in which various governments can make it more possible for people to be upwardly socially mobile. I've also always been excited about getting vaccinated. I don't know where that comes from, but this is the meme that I sent to my friends. Many of whom are on this call. Love you guys. Last year around September, encouraging them to get their COVID boosters and their flu shots. This is a special time because many of us are due for our tetanus boosters. But this year, I've got a niece making her global debut in early September. So instead of getting my regular September 17th birthday flu shot, I'll be getting vaccinated a little bit earlier this year in anticipation of her arrival. And all of my students have heard me tell them to write about the things that make them most upset in the world. So this dissertation is in large part focused on, or comes out of my experience of lockdown, being upset with what I saw as vaccine hesitancy, anti-mask mandates and protests, plots to kidnap governors because of their COVID restrictions. And it didn't sit right with me such that I couldn't let it go to the extent that it really turned into almost a whole manuscript at this point. But what is my dissertation depends on who I'm talking to. This is also why anytime anybody's asked me over the last couple of years, what is your dissertation about? You've probably gotten a different answer every time. I'm also hopeful that my advisor in the room will show me that I'm not lying when I say this. This is truly all of the things that my dissertation is. But when I speak to historians, it's a distinctly, sensibly backwards-looking enterprise. I study the time period between 1945, the end of World War II, and about 1980, the global eradication of smallpox. And in that time period, I historicize the concept of global health security. Many scholars point to that as having originated in the 90s. I also discuss the utility of military assistance versus development aid as sort of a tool of American foreign policy in that time period. And when I talk to historians of medicine, I'll tell them I provide a sort of examination of the sociopolitical vaccine hesitancy. When I work with political officials and DoD officials increasingly, it's a much more presentist, task-oriented manner in which I communicate what my dissertation is. So I'll tell them, or they often ask me to historicize a current problem. Lately, that's been the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But last fall, it was how do we communicate about flu vaccines despite a government shutdown happening at the start of flu season. Increasingly, when I speak to DoD officials, I talk about current gaps in our biosurveillance programming. Like we lived through one pandemic and we're poorly prepared for the next one. And that really should stress us all out. But I think it's particularly stressful to the public health people in this room and in general. When I'm talking to them, it's a much more future-oriented, solutions-oriented dissertation that I share. So I share that I analyze vaccine communications and associated considerations of trust, both in the mouthpiece of those vaccine communications, but also in the ways in which that vaccine media is received by the public that's consuming it. You'll also hear me in a few slides talk about the ways in which the method by which a public health intervention is delivered can affect the success of that public health intervention. So you'll hear me talk a lot about horizontal vaccine programming, wherein vaccines are delivered in sort of a primary healthcare setting, targeting multiple diseases at a time, rather than vertical vaccine programming, wherein vaccines, single inoculant often, is targeting just one infectious target, often in the context of an eradication campaign. But what's actually in my dissertation, if that's my dissertation as a whole? So the first 2 chapters really draw on records from the National Archives. Thank you, David, for making that trip possible. I was actually in DC when the Trump indictment about the mishandling of the Mar-a-Lago documents was handed down. That made for a very spicy commute to the National Archives on those days. But the first chapter, I define what I call, again, more puns, American medium power, and I distinguish American medium power from harder, previous models of European colonialism. So American medium power, as expressed after World War II, is not the explicitly colonial mercantilist enterprise that European empire was prior to that. Instead, I argue that that medium power is expressed through the instruments I really dive into in the second chapter of this dissertation, where I identify a programmatic squishiness, but what in the final draft of my dissertation will be an epistemological ambiguity between military aid and development assistance. 1 second. Ooh.
Like, you see what you're saying? Just a little bit quieter and see if that works. I don't know.
If I move further away,
Say that again?
I don't know how to do that.
I don't know.
On the side.
Sorry, team. Tech timeout.
Try now, Karen, try to begin.
Hi, friends. Is this okay? Okay. Thanks,
This
Jennifer.
is concerning.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
No, thank you, Jennifer. Yes, the second chapter of my dissertation takes the power, the American foreign policy power that I've articulated in the first chapter, and sort of explores the instruments through which it's expressed in the second chapter. Those instruments are military aid and development assistance, but I've identified, again, a programmatic squishiness between those. So in that chapter, I rely heavily on declassified National Security Council minutes. And for example, in the early 1950s, I've got top-notch generals deciding where food aid should go, what form that food aid should take, and when it should be sent to Pakistan, which at the time had just suffered after the assassination of one of its first prime ministers, barely independent nation. But these generals were hoping to send food aid to Pakistan so that America could utilize those military assets in the ongoing conflict in Korea. A few decades later, gas prices are way too high in America. So I've got communiques from State Department officials asking top tier generals in the DoD to send Saudi royals couple of aircraft, lots of weaponry, in the hopes that the provision of those, I'm editorializing here, militarized toys will encourage OPEC and Saudi officials to reduce oil prices and gas prices in America. And it's that squishiness of what military aid is meant to do, what development assistance is meant to do, that I argue leads to what I call a defensive dominance, wherein I use the metaphor of a hammer and a nail in this chapter of my dissertation, wherein America at this point has a big honking military hammer, and now all of the geostrategic problems confronting America look like a nail through which the military can be the first sort of American actor to engage with. That's problematic for public health, and I make that public health turn in the third chapter of my dissertation, where I discuss biosurveillance, but mostly bad examples of biosurveillance. I've identified that intrusive methods of biosurveillance, often delivered in the context of a smallpox eradication campaign, can be experienced by those targeted as military intelligence gathering. That's especially true in places like Pakistan and Mexico, where there's been significant geographic overlap between military interventions and the mass vaccination campaigns I'll discuss in a second. But that, I think it's funny, not funny, horrific, but it is interesting that the way in which the use of military force can have for decades after long-term effects on vaccine uptake and other public health outcomes. The last 2 chapters of my dissertation, my national case studies, the first one is Mexico, and I really showcase Mexico as a great example for the merits of horizontal public health programming. To be fair, Mexico had, compared to Pakistan, about 120, 140 year head start as the site of the world's first mass vaccination campaign. But we see that the construction of those robust public health infrastructures, with a little bit of assistance from the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s, Mexico was also able to build up a public health workforce by dint of which the people who were doing the vaccinating in Mexico looked like the patients on the ground. in tandem, the government, the Mexican federal government, was also a critical pro-vaccine voice and actively countered anti-vax media that was disseminated at the time by their political rivals. This is just one example where they used the culturally relevant pastime of football, soccer, to encourage polio vaccine uptake. And this is specifically for a polio campaign in the 1980s, but material like this was disseminated to encourage just routine childhood school immunizations too. And it makes me upset every time I see a CDC graphic that's like sanitized and not that exciting, when we could be having really cool pro-vaccine media like this. In contrast, Pakistan has a much more vertically oriented vaccination programming. In many ways, they've been subject to the significant Western presence of the WHO and American institutions in funding and administering those programs, especially historically. But we see, again, that sort of vertical vaccination programming engenders political resistance and increasingly violent resistance because people are rejecting vaccinations not on the basis of the safety of the product or their perception of the risk that a disease might present, but on the basis of anti-American, anti-Western imperialism. Oh. But what is cool about my dissertation? That's what's in it. That's what the project is intended to be. This is what I think is cool about my dissertation. And again, what could be cool about y'all's research? I think history is a useful data set. I'll be so real. This is a battle I'm still fighting on Capitol Hill. When I work with politicians and congressional staffers, anything that happened before 9/11 is utterly irrelevant. And increasingly, anything that happened before 2016 is just not a relevant data set to policymakers. So my dissertation uses historical data and the archival record to sort of do something, I hope, about vaccine hesitancy today. I'm also really, really glad that I've been given the flexibility by my committee in this department to write for multiple different types of audiences. So the last piece I published, it was a distillation of the second chapter of this dissertation with a little bit of commentary on ongoing congressional budget negotiations. I published that in one DC outlet. It got picked up around the country, and now I've got really kind feedback on that piece from South Korea in my Twitter DMs. So it's been really nice to see that there's broad international and non-academic appeal to my research. And lastly, I get disheartened about my research sometimes because I've been doing this for a couple of years, and I've got more questions than answers. But I'm reminded that at the core of this dissertation is my commitment to justice and my really genuine desire to do good in the world. So I'm reminded, this is a quote that was shared with me at an awards lunch last spring by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or President Biden's chief military advisor, who said, "In the absence of data, there's only principle." And I'm really proud of the fact that I haven't answered all the questions I wanted to answer in my dissertation, but I still feel that this is an accurate, rigorous, meticulously researched way of expressing how I want to do good in the world. And I'm conscious of the time, Jennifer, so thank y'all. And I'm happy to answer your questions.
I think it's me, honestly. Questions, I would say raise your hands, and we'll figure it out. So in the absence of Ron being here to ask the first question, somebody needs to go ahead and say who your question's for, so I can.
Sure, so this question is for Sarah.
Okay.
That's my brother.
Oh, okay. There's brother here. Why don't you come over here and I'll try to.
One of relatively few non-experts in this field in the room, I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind just breaking it down and maybe offer some thoughts on like what is the one or small handful of actual policy recommendations effective today in helping to reduce vaccine skepticism, like hesitancy and skepticism.
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on I'd say, as all the public health people in this room would, that the policy should be tailored to the population that you're trying to vaccinate, right? So in America, I think one of the big problems is trust in the government. The vaccines are readily available, especially COVID vaccines are made to be free and accessible. So the issue of supply isn't an issue in America in the way that it is in Pakistan. So in America, I'd say, let's generate some trust. Easier said than done, of course, but let's generate some trust in the scientific institutions disseminating that message. In Pakistan, and less of a case in Mexico, I'd say there's an issue of supply in some cases, that vaccines are difficult to transport, difficult to get to the areas where they need to be administered. And indeed, the violent vaccine refusal is a big problem for women, especially who are doing the vaccinating. So let's make the supply easier to get in some places and the demand more stimulated in others. I should point out my brother is an expert in things, just not public health.
Question for Sadie or Valentina? James.
Alexa, turn off.
Okay, question for all three of them.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. Completely fascinating. Historical analysis. Thank you. I'm curious if you could identify one new idea or project that you have for when you finished your dissertation and you've deposited and you're on your next research project. Usually when people are doing a dissertation, lots of ideas for future study come up. I'd love to hear about them.
Well, I guess, I suppose so. Yeah. So I actually, it's something I'd like to pick up. It's something I kind of found. We're doing this research and it is related to the dissertation, but just, given like length constraints and things, I decided to kind of keep it for later. But one of the things I found really interesting about the case study of influenza is how its identity shifts, especially in the context of the Cold War. So depending on the particular actor, you have this rhetoric about how, the infection, the idea that it could be naturally unpredictable, that through processes of shift and drift in the context of talking about China, whereas in the context of talking about the Soviet Union, the focus is on manufactured warfare. And influenza actually becomes something that underpins later kind of refashionings of the notions of how does the United States prepare for biological warfare. And that's something I think I'd like to explore a bit more, like that notion, again, related to security and obviously disease, but kind of this interplay between the notion of unpredictable, like, something that is naturally unpredictable versus something that has a manufactured unpredictability. And I just think that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. Something that has come up, I've found that like honing in on a theme and like thinking about space and geography and has been a helpful way to like filter some of the more like less fully formed ideas because I can kind of like put them through that lens. And one of the things I've been interested to come back to is the relationship between departments of public health and public health surveillance and abortion especially in the 1970s, like around when Roe v. Wade happens. There's a lot of people traveling for abortion care from state to state, and there are a lot of issues that come up in terms of like surveillance and sort of governance of the movement of people from place to place that I think would be especially relevant in our current sort of hellish abortion climate in this country.
I've got, that's the person who had the most time to answer this question. The thing that comes to mind is one of an issue of communications and one of like proper biosurveillance. So I'd love to write like a pro-vaccine media manual. It's something I've piloted or I have a draft of it written for the Population Reference Bureau, but I'd love to get that out into the world. But also, I really do think that we're, as a nation, but also as a globe, like uniquely vulnerable to another infectious threat, worried about another pandemic. So I'm hoping that we can fill in some of those gaps because, James, as you know, Cold War vaccination campaigns were hampered by their inability to detect vaccine hesitancy and indeed interpreted it in such a way that resulted in more intrusive biosurveillance and reduced vaccine uptake. So if I could fix that issue, I think we'd be all safer, but also gonna need a whole team behind me to make that happen.
Great. We have, I think 2 minutes left. So in a sentence or two, what do you wish you had known when you started your dissertation in terms of how to do a dissertation?
Oh. So many.
Just make something up here.
I guess what I would say is to just, you don't have to do it alone, right? Like, especially in history, it's a very isolated exercise. I spent a lot of time in the archives alone, sitting at my computer alone. So again, I had an incredible committee behind me, an incredible department behind me, also just great friends, and Valentina and Sadie and Alyssa, who can't be here today, but is on the Zoom call. So yeah, don't do it alone, is my piece of advice.
Um, I, I don't know. I think mine is just a little bit more straightforward, maybe just in terms of like outlines are really important. I was never someone who needed to use an outline in the sense of, I knew it was important, obviously, but now I made it this far, not needing to worry about an outline. And I really understood quickly that outlines are very important. So it's not groundbreaking, but that's what I learned.
It's very good advice. And yeah, I could take the same advice. I guess I would say, this probably applies for all disciplines, but especially history. Like, you can have a really good idea that you could write a really compelling proposal about, but in the absence of strong source material, you're kind of at sea. And so I would say, I mean, this was definitely something we all encountered trying to do research at the height of like pandemic lockdowns. It definitely made archival research more difficult. But I think just in general, like identifying whether it's archives or other kinds of source material, like identifying what those sources are going to be really soon in the process, and then building your idea and your argument around that. I sort of wish I had done it more in that direction and less in the like, I have a really cool concept. Now I have to find stuff.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Kudos for your creativity, tenacity. You make us proud. We can't wait to see you receive your degrees and go on to world domination.
Oh, yeah.